In the dying town of Millbrook, most folks had stopped asking questions about the quiet old man who tended the livery stable. Jed Hawkins kept to himself, spoke softly, and moved with the careful grace of someone used to avoiding attention. But when Randy Monroe and his gang torched Jed's cabin and desecrated his family's graves, they made a mistake that would shake the foundations of their small empire. They thought they were dealing with just another broken-down old-timer they could bully at will. They hadn't noticed the pearl-handled revolver he kept carefully hidden beneath his coat, or the way his weathered hands moved with deadly precision even after all these years. They didn't know that 15 years ago, before he buried his wife and son, people had whispered the name Hawk with equal measures of awe and terror across the Western Territories. Some men spend their whole lives running from violence, only to discover that violence eventually finds them anyway. And when it does, the deadliest gunslinger in a generation has to choose between keeping a solemn promise to his dead family or watching evil triumph in a town that's finally become home. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The sun hung low over Millbrook, casting long shadows across its weather-beaten buildings like fingers reaching for something long lost. Once a bustling hub of cattle drives and commerce, the town now stood as a hollow reminder of its former self, its peeling paint and creaking boards telling stories of better days. Main Street stretched out like an old scar through the heart of town, its wooden sidewalks worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The bank's gold lettering had faded to a dull yellow, and the general store's windows were clouded with years of dust that no one bothered to clean anymore. Even the famous Golden Spur Saloon, once the crown jewel of Millbrook's nightlife, had lost its shine, its swinging doors moving with a tired squeak in the hot afternoon breeze. Inside the town stables, Jed Hawkins worked methodically, his weathered hands moving with practiced ease as he brushed down a chestnut mare. At 68, his face was a map of deep lines and old stories, partially hidden beneath a silver-streaked beard. His movements, though slowed by age, carried a fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. "Easy there, girl," he murmured, his voice gentle as he worked out a knot in the horse's mane. "Ain't nothing to fret about." Outside the stable, two women paused their conversation to watch him work. "That's him, you know," Martha Wilson whispered to her friend, adjusting her basket of fresh bread. "Old Jed Hawkins. Been here going on 5 years now, and nobody knows where he came from." Sarah Cooper nodded, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. "I heard tell he showed up the same day as that big dust storm, looking like he'd ridden through hell itself. My Thomas says he's never heard him say more than 10 words together. Some folks say he was something special once," Martha continued, lowering her voice further. "Way he moves sometimes like a cat, even at his age. And did you notice? He always keeps that long coat on, even in this heat. Probably hiding something under there," Sarah replied, then jumped as Jed's steel-gray eyes met hers through the stable door. Both women hurried away, their skirts rustling in the dust. Jed returned to his work, used to the whispers that followed him through town. The locals had their theories: retired lawman, reformed outlaw, bounty hunter gone soft, but none of them came close to the truth. And that's exactly how he wanted it. The afternoon wore on, the sun beating down mercilessly on Millbrook's tired streets. Jed finished with the horses and began sweeping the stable floor, the rhythmic sound of the broom against wooden planks almost meditative. "Hey there, Hawkins," a friendly voice called out. Tom Miller, the blacksmith, stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the light. "Few of us are heading over to the Golden Spur for a drink. Care to join? First round's on me." Jed kept sweeping, though his hands tightened slightly on the broom handle. "Appreciate the offer, Tom, but I've got work to finish here." "Work will still be here tomorrow," Tom pressed, taking a step inside. "Come on, been here 5 years, and I barely know you better than the day you arrived. What's your story anyway?" "No story worth telling," Jed replied quietly, not looking up. "Just an old man trying to live quiet." Tom opened his mouth to argue further, but something in Jed's posture made him think better of it. "Suit yourself," he said with a shrug. "Offer stands if you change your mind." As Tom's footsteps faded away, Jed leaned the broom against the wall and pulled out his pocket watch. Nearly sunset, Time for his usual evening meal at the saloon. He preferred going early, before the crowd and noise picked up. Adjusting his coat to make sure it fell properly, he stepped out into the dying light. The Golden Spur was relatively empty when he entered, just a few regulars nursing their drinks. Jed took his usual corner table, the one that gave him a clear view of both the entrance and the back door. Old habits died hard. "Evening, Mr. Hawkins," Betty, the aging barmaid, said as she approached. "The usual?" Jed nodded, and soon a bowl of stew and a cup of coffee appeared before him. He ate slowly, methodically, barely looking up when the saloon's doors burst open with a bang. Randy Monroe swaggered in with his gang, their boots loud against the wooden floor. At 25, Randy was the only son of Earl Monroe, the richest rancher in the county. He'd never worked a day in his life, preferring to spend his father's money and throw his weight around town with his three cronies, Jack Wilson, Pete Dawson, and Mike Taylor. "Another successful day, boys," Randy announced loudly, slapping a stack of bills on the bar. "Drinks for everyone. Well, everyone worth drinking with, that is." The gang laughed, and several regulars raised their glasses in thanks, though their eyes held more fear than gratitude. Randy's successful days usually meant someone in town had been strong-armed or cheated. "Did you see old man Peterson's face when we told him about that new grazing fee?" Jack snickered, accepting a whiskey from the bartender. "Thought he was going to have a heart attack right there." "Serve him right," Randy replied, scanning the room like a king surveying his domain. His eyes fell on Jed in the corner, and a cruel smile spread across his face. Well, if it ain't the mysterious Mr. Hawkins." "What's wrong, old-timer?" "Too good to celebrate with the rest of us." Jed continued eating his stew, acting as if he hadn't heard. This seemed to irritate Randy, who sauntered over to his table. "Nice that you got there," Randy said, reaching out to flick the brim of Jed's well-worn cowboy hat. "Must have been real something, about 30 years ago." His gang snickered behind him. Jed carefully wiped his mouth with a napkin, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Excuse me," he said quietly, standing up. "I believe I'm finished here." Leaving so soon?" Randy stepped into his path, towering over the older man. "What's your hurry? And what's with this coat, anyway? Must be 100 degrees outside." He reached for Jed's lapel. In one smooth motion, Jed stepped back just out of reach. The movement was so fluid, so practiced, that Randy blinked in surprise. For just a moment, something dangerous flickered in the old man's eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by careful neutrality. "Boy," Jed said softly, "you're playing a game you don't understand. Best leave it be." He stepped around Randy and headed for the door, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. As he passed the bar, he placed a coin down for his meal. "Yeah, that's right. Run away," Randy called after him, his face red with embarrassment. "Looks like we found ourselves a genuine coward, boys. Probably been running his whole life." Jed pushed through the saloon doors and out into the twilight. As he walked away, his coat shifted slightly, revealing the worn pearl handle of a revolver nestled against his hip. The metal caught the last rays of sunlight, winking like a deadly secret. The walk home took him to the outskirts of town, where his modest cabin stood alone against the darkening sky. It wasn't much, 2 rooms and a poor excuse for a porch, but it suited his needs. Inside, the walls were bare except for a few hooks holding his spare clothes and gun belt. Jed lit a lantern and moved to the bedroom, where a small wooden box sat on the bedside table. He opened it carefully, revealing a daguerreotype photograph protected by a cloth. In the image, a beautiful woman smiled at the camera, her arms around a young boy of about 10. Both had been gone for 15 years now, but the pain in Jed's chest felt as fresh as ever. "I promised you," he whispered, touching the photograph gently. "No more violence. No more death. I promised I'd leave it all behind." He glanced at the revolver on his hip, the weight of it suddenly heavy with memory. "But sometimes, Mary, sometimes promises get mighty hard to keep." Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its cry echoing across the empty plains. Jed closed the box and moved to his window, looking out at the vast darkness. Tomorrow would bring another day of whispers and work, of careful steps and buried memories. But for now, in the quiet of his cabin, He allowed himself to remember who he had once been, and pray that person would stay buried where he belonged. The sound of Randy's laughter echoed in his mind, along with the fear he'd seen in the townspeople's eyes. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the way he used to feel a storm approaching across the prairie. Sooner or later, he knew, he'd have to make a choice between keeping his promise to the dead and protecting the living. But that was a problem for another day. For now, Jed Hawkins, once known as Hawk to every lawman and outlaw west of the Mississippi, pulled his curtains closed and prepared for another night of uneasy sleep, haunted by the ghosts of his past and the growing tension of his present. The night settled over Millbrook like a heavy blanket, and somewhere in the darkness, Destiny was loading its chambers, preparing to test an old gunslinger's resolve one final time. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Jed made his way to Thompson's general store. The town was starting to stir, shopkeepers sweeping their porches and ranch hands heading out for the day's work. Jed carried an empty burlap sack over his shoulder, his weekly shopping list tucked in his shirt pocket. Inside the store, the shelves were stocked with everything from dried goods to horse liniment. Old man Thompson nodded a greeting from behind the counter, busy tallying figures in his ledger. "Morning, Mr. Hawkins," he said without looking up. "Just got some fresh coffee beans in yesterday." Jed moved through the aisles methodically, selecting items with care: coffee, sugar, beans, a new curry comb for the horses. He was reaching for a tin of tobacco when the store's bell jingled, announcing new customers. Randy Monroe's laugh filled the space before he even stepped through the door. "And then I told him, either pay up now, or we'll see how well your barn stands without those support beams." His gang's appreciative chuckles followed. Jed continued his shopping, moving quietly despite his size. But Randy had already spotted him. "Well, if it ain't the mysterious Mr. Hawkins," Randy drawled, deliberately bumping into the older man's shoulder. "Doing your little errands?" Jed said nothing, placing a can of peaches in his sack. Randy's eyes narrowed at being ignored. "Hey, I'm talking to you, old man." He grabbed the sack from Jed's hands and upended it, sending supplies scattering across the floor. Cans rolled under shelves, coffee beans spread like dark marbles, and the new curry comb clattered against the wall. "Oops," Randy smirked as his gang howled with laughter. "Guess you'll have to start over." Mr. Thompson half rose from his seat. "Now see here, Randy. You stay out of this, Thompson," Pete Dawson warned, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Unless you want your store to have an accident too." The old shopkeeper sank back down, his face flushed with shame. The only sound was the rolling of the lascan coming to rest against a shelf. Jed stood perfectly still for a moment, then slowly knelt and began gathering his scattered supplies. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if he were alone in the store. "Look at him, boys," Randy sneered. "Like a broken-down old horse, ain't he? No fight left at all." The door chimed again, and Lucy Barnes stepped in, her apron indicating she was on her way to start her shift at the Golden Spur. She took in the scene with sharp brown eyes, her pretty face hardening with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, moving to help Jed collect his things. "Stay out of it, Lucy," Jed said quietly, not looking up. "It's not worth it." "But Mr. Hawkins." "He's right, sweetheart," Randy cut in, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Wouldn't want a nice girl like you getting mixed up with a coward." Lucy stood her ground, chin raised. "The only cowards I see are men who need 3 friends to help them bully an elderly person." The smile dropped from Randy's face. "You ought to be careful who you stand up for, Lucy. Never know when someone might accidentally spill something on that pretty dress of yours." His gang moved closer, their expressions threatening. "That's enough." Jed's voice was soft but carried a weight that made everyone freeze. He stood slowly, his recovered supplies in the sack. "Miss Barnes, thank you for your concern, but I believe you have work to attend to." Something in his tone made Lucy step back, though her eyes still flashed with anger. Jed placed some coins on the counter, nodded to Thompson, and walked toward the door. As he passed Randy, he paused. "You want to hurt someone?" he said, barely above a whisper. "Hurt me. Leave others out of it." Then he was gone, leaving Randy red-faced and fuming in his wake. The days that followed brought a steady stream of torment. Jed would arrive at the stable to find his tools missing, forcing him to waste precious morning hours searching or borrowing replacements from Tom the blacksmith. His belongings seemed to sprout legs and walk away. A hammer here, a pair of pliers there, even his favorite brush for grooming the horses. One particularly hot afternoon, he discovered his saddle hanging from a beam, slashed beyond repair. The leather was cut in deliberate patterns, almost artistic in their cruelty. Jed ran his fingers over the ruined material, his face unreadable as he traced the damage. Tom the blacksmith found him there, still examining the saddle. "Jesus, Jed," he breathed, taking in the destruction. "This has gone far enough. We need to talk to the sheriff." Jed carefully took down what remained of his saddle. "Sheriff's got enough troubles," he said quietly. "Besides, no proof who did it." "No proof?" Tom exploded. "Everyone knows it's Randy Monroe and his bunch of thugs. They're getting bolder by the day, and if someone doesn't stand up to them, then that's for someone else to decide." Jed cut him off, his voice firm. "I've made my choice, Tom. Let it be." The blacksmith threw up his hands in frustration and stormed off, leaving Jed alone with his ruined equipment and his thoughts. That evening, as the sun began to set, Jed made his way to the Golden Spur for his usual meal. The saloon was more crowded than usual, the air thick with tobacco smoke and tension. He could feel eyes on him as he took his regular corner table, but he ignored them, focusing on his bowl of stew. Lucy brought him a cup of coffee without being asked, her movements quick and nervous. "They're drunk tonight," she whispered, nodding toward Randy's gang at the bar. "Maybe you should eat at home." Before Jed could respond, Randy's voice boomed across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen." He pushed away from the bar, swaying slightly. "You're in for a treat tonight. We're about to witness a showdown." The crowd parted as Randy strutted toward Jed's table, his spurs jingling with each exaggerated step. His gang followed, spreading out to block any escape route. "Stand up, old man," Randy commanded, drawing his revolver with theatrical flourish. He pointed it at the ceiling, his finger loose on the trigger. "Time to see what you're made of." The other patrons drew back, pressing against the walls. Lucy stood frozen behind the bar, her hand gripping a bottle like a weapon. The only sound was the creaking of floorboards as people shifted nervously. Jed wiped his mouth with a napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside his empty plate. Only then did he look up at Randy. "You're playing with fire, son," he said quietly. Randy's face twisted. "Don't call me son, you yellow-bellied coward. Stand up and face me." Randy Monroe. Betty, the aged barmaid, stepped forward. "Your father would be ashamed." The gun swung toward her, making her stumble back with a gasp. "My father ain't here, is he? And this ain't about him. This is about—" The words died in his throat as Jed stood up. Something had changed in the old man's bearing, something indefinable but profound. His eyes, usually careful and distant, now held a cold light that made Randy's hand tremble slightly. For just a moment, the young bully glimpsed something ancient and deadly looking out from behind those eyes. Then Jed blinked, and it was gone. "If you're quite finished," the old man said mildly, "I have horses to tend to." He placed a coin on the table and walked out, his boots silent on the wooden floor. The encounter sparked new rumors throughout town. Randy's gang, stinging from their leader's moment of visible fear, began spreading stories at every opportunity. "Heard he used to run with the Wilson gang," Jack would say in staged whispers at the saloon, "till they hit a bank in Kansas. Story goes he ran away in the middle of the job, left his partners to get gunned down." "That ain't what I heard," Pete would counter, loud enough to be overheard. "Way I heard it, he was a hired gun who turned yellow right when his employer needed him. Got a whole family killed with his cowardice." The whispers grew and twisted, each telling worse than the last. Some said he'd betrayed lawmen. Others claimed he'd abandoned women and children to die. The stories had little in common except their theme of cowardice and betrayal. Lucy listened to it all, her concern growing with each new tale. During quiet moments at the saloon, she began asking questions of the older patrons, particularly those who'd lived out west for many years. "Charlie," she asked the ancient stable hand one afternoon, "you've been around these parts a long time, haven't you?" The old man squinted at her over his coffee. "Going on 50 years now. Started when I was just a boy, working ranches all over the territory. Then you must have heard lots of stories, met all sorts of interesting people, Charlie's roomy eyes twinkled. You're asking about Hawkins, ain't you? Lucy blushed but didn't deny it. It's just the way he moves sometimes. The way he handles himself. He's not just some old drifter, is he? Can't say for certain, Charlie replied carefully. But I will say this. The way he carries himself reminds me of men I knew back in the day. Men you didn't want to cross, if you know what I mean. Lucy opened her mouth to ask more, but Charlie suddenly became very interested in his coffee, and she knew she'd get nothing more from him that day. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday morning. Jed arrived at the stable to find his horse, a gentle mare named Belle, favoring her left front leg. Someone had wrapped a thin wire around her fetlock during the night, just tight enough to cause pain without being immediately noticeable. For the first time, real anger showed on Jed's face as he carefully removed the wire. The mare whimpered in pain, and he stroked her neck, murmuring soft words of comfort. Some things a man can't forgive, he whispered, leading her slowly toward Tom's smithy for treatment. The morning crowd parted before him, perhaps sensing the change in his demeanor. They saw something different in his walk that morning, something that made them pull their children closer and step off the wooden sidewalk as he passed. It was as if a mask had slipped, just slightly, revealing a glimpse of something dangerous beneath. That night, in his cabin, Jed sat at his small table with his revolver laid out before him. The pearl handle gleamed in the lamplight as he cleaned each part with practiced care, his movements precise and familiar. Each piece was tended to with the attention of a craftsman, or perhaps a priest preparing for a sacred ritual. From the wooden box by his bed, Mary and their son smiled their frozen daguerreotype smile, watching as his hands moved over the weapon with the intimacy of an old lover. Not yet, he whispered, watching the lamplight play along the barrel. But soon, a man can only bend so far before he breaks, or remembers he was never meant to bend at all. He holstered the gun and stepped out onto his porch. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the empty plains, their cries wild and mournful. Somewhere in town, Randy Monroe was probably laughing, probably planning his next act of cruelty, unaware that he was dancing closer and closer to an edge he couldn't see. Jed looked up at the stars, countless and cold in the vast western sky. He tried to live quietly, tried to honor his promise to Mary. But as the wind carried the coyotes' cries across the prairie, he knew in his bones that soon he would have to choose between keeping his word to the dead and protecting the living. The night stretched out before him, dark and full of possibilities, while behind him, the revolver waited patiently in its holster, like destiny holding its breath. The Golden Spur was quiet in the late afternoon, that lull between the lunch crowd and evening regulars. Lucy wiped down tables while Charlie Jenkins, the oldest patron in town, nursed his daily coffee in his usual corner. His weathered face held nearly 8 decades of Western history, and his stories were as much a part of the saloon as its creaking floorboards. "Tell me again about the old days, Charlie," Lucy said, pausing in her work. "About the real gunfighters, before all these young pretenders showed up." Charlie's roomy eyes sparkled with memory. "A lot of men claimed to be fast in those days, girl. But there was one." He paused, taking a deliberate sip of coffee. "One they called Hawk. Fastest draw I ever saw. And I saw plenty." Lucy pulled up a chair, her cleaning forgotten. "What made him different?" "Everything." Charlie's voice took on a distant quality. "Most gunfighters, they make a show of it. Lots of fancy moves, big talk. Not Hawk. He was quiet. Didn't swagger, didn't boast. Just moved like a shadow and shot like lightning." "You saw him in action?" Charlie nodded slowly. "Once in Dodge City, must have been 30 years ago. Some tough from Texas was causing trouble, calling out anyone who'd face him. Had already killed 2 men that week." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Hawk was passing through, minding his own business. Texas tough didn't know who he was, started running his mouth." Lucy found herself leaning in too, caught up in the old man's words. "Fight was over before it really began," Charlie continued. "Hawk's gun just appeared in his hand, like magic. One shot, clean and precise. Texas Tough was dead before he cleared leather." The old man shook his head. "But here's the thing. Hawk didn't celebrate, didn't preen or boast. Just looked tired, holstered his gun and walked away." "Did you ever learn his real name?" Jed Hawkins, Charlie said quietly. Though most folks didn't know that. Lucy's breath caught. Charlie, are you saying? Mind fetching me some more coffee, girl? Charlie cut her off, suddenly interested in the window. Getting a mite cold. That evening, Lucy watched Jed more carefully during his usual meal. The way he held his cup, the precise economy of his movements, the perfect awareness of everyone in the room. All of it spoke of something more than just an old stable hand. When he paid his bill, she noticed something she'd overlooked before. The pearl-handled revolver at his hip bore the initials JH in flowing script. That night, after closing, she lay awake thinking about Charlie's story. Could the quiet old man, who tended horses, really be the legendary Hawk? As she pondered this, miles away, Jed Hawkins was lost in memories he'd tried for years to bury. The scent of sage and gun smoke filled his dreams, taking him back 30 years to a sun-baked street in New Mexico territory. He was younger then, his hair still dark, his movements fluid as water. Across from him stood Jake, the Snake Mitchell, a killer with 17 notches on his gun. Last chance to walk away, Mitchell, Dream Jed said quietly. There's no pride worth dying for. Mitchell sneered, his hand hovering over his gun. The great Hawk, trying to talk his way out? Maybe the stories about you are just that, stories. Your choice. Jed's voice carried no emotion, but his eyes were sad. He already knew how this would end. The street was silent except for the hot wind whistling between buildings. 100 eyes watched from windows and doorways, waiting to see if the legend was true. Mitchell's hand twitched. Fast, faster than most men could follow. But Jed was already moving, his draw so smooth it seemed impossible. The shot cracked across the street like thunder. Mitchell looked surprised as he fell, his gun only halfway cleared from its holster. Jed walked over to check him, though he knew it wasn't necessary. The shot had been perfect, just like always. The crowd emerged, chattering excitedly, but Jed didn't hear their praise. He was looking at his reflection in a shop window, seeing not a triumphant victor, but a man who just sent another soul to judgment. Even if that soul had deserved it. The dream shifted, blurred, became memory. A year later, he met Mary Davidson at a church social in Kansas. She was nothing like the women who usually chase gunfighters. No fascination with violence, no romantic notions about his reputation. She simply saw him as a man, and that changed everything. They married that autumn. A year later, their son Thomas was born. For the first time in his life, Jed knew real peace. He hung up his gun, took honest work as a rancher, and felt the weight of his past growing lighter with each passing season. Then came the day that shattered everything. He'd ridden into town for supplies, leaving Mary and Thomas at the ranch. He was haggling over the price of seed when he heard the shots. By the time he got home, the ranch house was burning. He found Mary and Thomas in the yard, executed at close range. Pinned to Mary's dress was a note. The Snake sends his regards. Jake Mitchell's brother had waited 5 years to take his revenge, picking the perfect moment when Hawk's guard was down. He hadn't even faced Jed himself, choosing instead to hurt him in the worst way possible. Jed snapped awake in his cabin, his face wet with tears. The memory was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday, not 15 years ago. He got up, pulled on his coat, and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The Millbrook cemetery lay on a small hill overlooking town. 2 simple wooden crosses marked the graves of Mary and Thomas Hawkins, moved here when Jed settled in town 5 years ago. He knelt between them, placing fresh wildflowers he'd gathered on his walk. I'm sorry, he whispered to the crosses. Sorry I couldn't protect you. Sorry I brought this life to our door. His voice caught. And sorry that I might have to break my promise. Things are happening here, Mary. Bad things. And I don't know if I can stay quiet much longer. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky when he heard footsteps behind him. Lucy stood there, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. Mr. Hawkins, she said softly, I thought I might find you here. Jed didn't turn around. Mighty early for a social call, Miss Barnes. I've been doing some thinking about Charlie's stories. About a man they called Hawk. Best let sleeping dogs lie, girl. Lucy took a step closer. The initials on your gun, JH. The way you move, the way you handle yourself. And these graves. She gestured to the crosses. What happened to them? Miss Barnes. Jed's voice was gentle, but carried a warning. Some questions are better left unasked. But if you are who I think you are, why do you let Randy and his gang treat you this way? Why not? Because violence begets violence. Jed cut her off, finally turning to face her. And once that will starts turning, it don't stop until everyone's been ground to dust. Back in town, Randy Monroe was already drinking his breakfast at the Golden Spur, his mood dark. Makes me sick, he slurred to his gang. That old man, acting so high and mighty, refusing to even acknowledge us. Maybe we should step things up, Pete suggested. Really show him what we can do. Randy's bloodshot eyes gleamed. Maybe we should. Maybe it's time to stop playing games. Later that morning, Lucy slipped into the town's small library, housed in a back room of the church. Mrs. Peterson, the librarian, looked up from her knitting. Looking for anything in particular, dear? Old newspapers, Lucy replied. From about 30 years ago, if you have them. Mrs. Peterson pointed her to a shelf of bound volumes. Mind the dust. Nobody's looked at those in years. Lucy spent hours carefully turning brittle pages, until finally, she found what she was looking for. The headline screamed across the yellowed paper. Hawk strikes again. Notorious gunslinger brings justice to New Mexico territory. The article described in detail the shooting of Jake Mitchell, painting Jed as a hero bringing law to the lawless territories. Several more articles followed his exploits over the years, each adding to the legend. Then she found it, a small item from 15 years ago, tucked away on page 6. Tragedy strikes former gunfighter's family. The article was brief but brutal, describing the murder of Mary and Thomas Hawkins by vengeful outlaws. After this, the article concluded, the once famous Hawk disappeared from public view. Many assume he has died, though rumors occasionally surface of a quiet man matching his description, living anonymously in various western towns. Lucy's hands trembled as she closed the volume. Everything made sense now. Jed's reluctance to engage, his quiet suffering of Randy's abuse, his determination to avoid violence at all costs. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Jed approach until his shadow fell across the table. Found what you were looking for? His voice was soft, but it made her jump. Mr. Hawkins. I was just digging up ghosts. He picked up the newspaper volume, glancing at the date. Dangerous occupation, that? The people should know who you are, Lucy insisted. Maybe then Randy and his gang would. Would what? Leave me alone? Jed shook his head sadly. Or maybe they'd try harder to prove themselves against the famous Hawk. Maybe they'd start hurting more people to draw me out. He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Curiosity can get you hurt in a town like this, Miss Barnes. Best remember that. He turned to leave, then paused. I've walked this path before, girl. Seen where it leads. Violence might solve problems quickly, but its solutions don't last. They just plant seeds for the next crop of trouble. His eyes were distant, seeing something far away and long ago. And those seeds always bloom in blood. Lucy watched him walk away, his boots silent on the wooden floor. Outside, the afternoon sun cast his shadow long and dark across Main Street, like a reminder of a past that refused to stay buried. In the Golden Spur, Randy Monroe was still drinking, still plotting. But now his usual petty cruelty had hardened into something more dangerous. He'd seen something in Jed's eyes during their last encounter, something that both frightened and enraged him. Time to show this town what happens to people who don't respect us, he muttered, fingering his gun. Time to make the old man dance. The sun began to set over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of fire. In his cabin, Jed sat cleaning his revolver, the pearl handle gleaming in the fading light. Mary and Thomas smiled down from their photograph, their frozen expressions both blessing and curse. I tried, he whispered to them. God knows I tried. But sometimes the past won't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the grave. The wind picked up outside, carrying the first cool breath of evening. Somewhere in the darkness, two forces were drawing together like storm clouds. Randy's growing malice and Jed's reluctant awakening. Soon, very soon, lightning would strike. And in Millbrook, the old-timers like Charlie could feel it coming. They'd seen it before, that peculiar tension in the air before violence bloomed. They watched Jed move through town with his careful grace, saw Randy's gang growing bolder, and knew that something had to break. The only question was how many would be broken with it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows down Millbrook's main street as Lucy and Jed stood outside the Golden Spur, their conversation carried away by the hot breeze. Lucy had just finished her shift, and Jed had stopped to ask about a package he was expecting from the weekly supply wagon. "Should arrive tomorrow," Lucy was saying, checking her small notebook. "I'll make sure Betty sets it aside for you." From across the street, Randy Monroe watched through the grimy window of the barber shop, his face darkening as he observed their easy interaction. Pete Dawson worked the lather into his leader's face with quick, nervous movements. "Look at that," Randy growled, causing Pete to nick him slightly with the razor. Little Lucy, acting all friendly with the coward. "After everything we've done to show this town what he really is." Jack Wilson leaned against the wall, cleaning his nails with a pocket knife. "Maybe she needs a lesson about picking sides." Randy's eyes narrowed as he watched Lucy laugh at something Jed said. "Maybe she does." He wiped the remaining lather from his face with a towel. "Tonight, when she walks home." The sun had long since set when Lucy finally left the saloon, having stayed late to help Betty with the monthly inventory. The streets of Millbrook were dark and quiet, most respectable folks already in bed. A half-moon provided just enough light to find her way along the familiar route home. She was halfway down Baker Street when she heard the footsteps behind her. Before she could react, more sounds emerged from the alley ahead. Boot heels on wooden planks, the soft clink of spurs, a low chuckle in the darkness. Lucy clutched her bag closer and quickened her pace, but it was too late. Randy and his gang stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. More footsteps behind her confirmed she was surrounded. "Evening, Lucy," Randy drawled, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. "Awful late for a lady to be out alone." Lucy backed away, but Pete and Mike had already moved to cut off her retreat. Her back hit the rough wall of the alley as they closed in. "I don't want any trouble," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Should have thought about that before you started cozying up to the old man," Randy replied. He reached out and grabbed her bag, yanking it from her grasp. The contents spilled across the dirt. Her notebook, some hair ribbons, a small mirror her mother had given her. Randy's boot came down hard on the mirror, the crack of breaking glass echoing off the alley walls. "Oops," he sneered. "Clumsy me." Lucy felt anger replace her fear. "What kind of men are you?" she demanded, ganging up on a woman in the dark. "Is this what makes you feel strong?" Randy's hand shot out, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. "You got a smart mouth, girl. Let's see what old Jed does when his favorite waitress shows up with a few bruises. Maybe then he'll..." "Let her go." The voice was quiet, but it carried such authority that everyone in the alley froze. Jed stood at the entrance, his figure silhouetted against the moonlight. No one had heard him approach. Randy recovered quickly, though his hand tightened on Lucy's arm. "Well, if it ain't the hero himself, come to save the damsel in distress." His gang laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Something about Jed's stillness made them uneasy. "Last warning," Jed said, taking a step forward. "Let her go." "Or what?" Randy shoved Lucy aside, sending her stumbling into the wall. "You'll run away again? Hide behind that sad story about your dead family." Lucy gasped. She hadn't told anyone what she'd learned in the library. Randy's cruel smile widened. "Oh yes, we did some reading too. Found out all about the Great Hawk and his tragic past." "Tell me, old man, did you cry when you found their bodies?" "Did you?" The change in Jed was subtle, but profound. He didn't move, didn't draw his gun, but suddenly the air in the alley felt electric, charged with deadly potential. Randy's words died in his throat as he finally saw what Lucy had glimpsed in the library. The legendary gunslinger wasn't gone, just sleeping. "You're not ready for what you're asking for," Jed said softly. Each word carried the weight of graves. "None of you are." Pete Dawson, drunk and stupid, chose that moment to act brave. He rushed forward, shoving Jed hard in the chest. Big talk from a broken-down old man. Jed moved like water, stepping aside, just enough for Pete to stumble past him. His hands never strayed toward his gun, but something in his economy of movement made it clear. He could have drawn and fired before Pete hit the ground. The moment stretched, heavy with possibility. Randy's hand hovered near his gun, but the memory of Jed's cold eyes in the saloon held him back. His other men shifted uncertainly, no longer confident in their superior numbers. "Walk away," Jed said quietly. "Leave Lucy alone. Leave everyone alone. Or we'll have a different kind of conversation, one you're not going to enjoy." Randy tried to laugh, but it came out forced. "Come on, boys. Let the coward have his moment." He backed away, trying to maintain some dignity. "This ain't over, old man. Not by a long shot." "Yes," Jed replied. "It is." They watched as Randy and his gang retreated into the darkness, their bravado gone. Only when their footsteps had faded completely did Jed turn to Lucy. "Are you hurt?" Lucy shook her head, still trembling slightly. "Just scared. And angry." She began gathering her scattered belongings, carefully avoiding the broken glass of her mirror. "Why do you let them treat you that way? I know who you are now, what you can do. Why not stop them?" "Because there's always a cost," Jed replied, kneeling to help her collect her things. "Violence is like a fire, girl. Easy to start, hard to control, and it burns everyone in the end. But sometimes fire is necessary," Lucy argued. "Sometimes it's the only way to fight the darkness." Jed's hands paused over a fallen hair ribbon. "I thought that once. Believed I was bringing justice to the territories, one bullet at a time." His voice grew distant. "Then I found something worth more than justice. Peace. A family. A quiet life." He handed her the ribbon. "Lost it all because I hadn't understood the simple truth. Violence always comes home to roost." They walked in silence to Lucy's boarding house, Jed a respectful distance behind, watching the shadows. At her door, Lucy turned to him. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming when you did." "Get some rest," Jed replied. "And Lucy." He paused. "Be careful. Randy Monroe's pride won't let this go." He waited until she was safely inside before starting the long walk to his cabin. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like spilled diamonds. But Jed's thoughts were dark, turned inward to places he'd tried for years to forget. In his cabin, he lit a lamp and sat at his small table. The revolver lay before him, its pearl handle gleaming in the yellow light. Mary and Thomas smiled down from their photograph, their faces frozen in a happiness he couldn't protect. Jed's weathered hands moved over the gun with familiar intimacy. Every scratch told a story. Every nick marked a life ended or changed forever. He tried so hard to leave it all behind, to honor Mary's last wish for peace. But now, he thought of Lucy in that alley, of the terror in her eyes. Thought of Randy Monroe's growing cruelty, the way it spread through town like poison. Sometimes a man had to choose between two wrongs, neither of them right. The lamp flickered, making shadows dance across the cabin walls. Somewhere in town, Randy was probably plotting his revenge, too proud and stupid to understand how close he'd come to death in that alley. One wrong move, one step too far, and 15 years of restraint might shatter like Lucy's mirror. Jed cleaned his gun with practiced care, each movement a meditation on choices past and future. When he finally lay down to sleep, his dreams were full of gun smoke and regret. In her room above the milliner's shop, Lucy lay awake, replaying the night's events. She'd been terrified, yes, but something else lingered in her mind. The way Jed had faced down 4 armed men without violence or fear. The way his quiet authority had turned their swagger to dust. She understood now what Charlie had tried to tell her about the difference between legend and truth. The stories painted Hawk as a deadly force of justice, a killer of killers. But the real legend wasn't in the violence Jed could unleash. It was in his power to hold it back. The old-time novels would never tell that story. They couldn't capture the courage it took to face mockery and abuse, to bear the weight of other people's cruelty, all to keep a promise to the dead. That was the real strength, the true heart of the man they called Hawk. Lucy's heart ached for him now, understanding the impossible choice he faced. Every insult he swallowed, every humiliation he endured, each one was an act of love for his lost family, a testament to his promise of peace. But for how long could any man, even one as strong as Jed Hawkins, bear such a burden? The night deepened, and Millbrook slept. But beneath its quiet surface, tensions were building like storm clouds on the horizon. Randy Monroe's pride had been wounded, his authority questioned. Jed's careful balance between past and present was growing more precarious by the day. And Lucy, lying in her narrow bed, began to understand that she was watching more than just the struggle of one man with his conscience. This was a battle for the soul of their town, between the crude power of bullies and the quiet strength of a man who had learned the true cost of violence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices. But for now, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the dramas playing out beneath them. In his cabin, Jed finally drifted off to sleep, his gun clean and ready on the bedside table. His dreams were full of Mary's smile, Thomas's laugh, and the weight of a promise that grew heavier with each passing day. The wind whispered through Millbrook's empty streets, carrying echoes of the past and hints of things to come. Change was coming, as inevitable as the dawn. The only question was how much blood would paint the sunrise when it finally arrived. The morning after the alley incident, Lucy found Charlie Jenkins at his usual table in the Golden Spur, nursing his morning coffee. The old man's eyes were clearer than usual, as if he'd been expecting her. "Sit down, girl," he said before she could speak. "Reckon it's time we had us a real talk about Jed Hawkins." Lucy slid into the chair across from him, her hands trembling slightly. "You knew all along, didn't you? Everything about him?" Charlie nodded slowly, his weathered face grave. "Was there the day he first made a name for himself?" Santa Fe, 1854. Gang of rustlers had been terrorizing the territory, killing anyone who stood in their way. Law couldn't touch them. He paused, taking a careful sip of coffee. Jed was just a deputy then, fresh-faced and serious. Rode into town tracking those rustlers. Found them in the saloon. 6 hard men who'd killed a dozen folks between them. "What happened?" Lucy leaned forward, caught up in the tale. "They drew on him, all 6 at once." Charlie's voice dropped to a whisper. When the smoke cleared, 5 were dead, and the 6th was on his knees begging for mercy. Fastest thing anyone had ever seen. That's when folks started calling him Hawk. Said he could spot trouble and strike before anyone knew what was happening. Lucy thought of Jed's quiet presence in the alley the night before, the way he'd moved with such controlled precision. He became a legend after that. More than that, he became hope. Charlie's eyes grew distant with memory. Territory was wild in those days. Good folks lived in fear of outlaws and gunmen. But Hawk, he was different. Never killed without cause. Never took advantage. Time and again, he'd ride into some town plagued by villains, clean things up, and ride out without asking for reward or glory. But something changed him, Lucy prompted gently. Charlie nodded, his face darkening. "Success has a price, girl. Every bad man he put down, every gang he broke up, they all had friends, family, people who wanted revenge." He stared into his coffee cup, and then he met Mary. The old man's voice grew softer, touched with sadness. Never seen Jed so happy as when he married her. A year later, they had Thomas. Jed hung up his guns, bought a little ranch in Kansas. Thought he could leave the past behind. Lucy remembered the newspaper article she'd found. But he couldn't. No. Charlie sighed heavily. Jake Mitchell's brother, William, spent 5 years plotting revenge. Waited until Jed's guard was down, then struck at what he loved most. The scene played out in Lucy's mind, drawn from Charlie's words. 15 years ago, a younger Jed Hawkins rode hard toward his ranch, smoke rising in the distance. The sound of his horse's hooves matched the pounding of his heart as he topped the last rise and saw his home in flames. "Mary," he screamed, spurring his horse faster. "Thomas." But he was too late. They lay in the yard, peaceful as if sleeping, except for the dark stains spreading beneath them. A note pinned to Mary's dress fluttered in the hot wind. "The snake sends his regards." Jed fell to his knees between them, gathering them close, his anguished howl echoing across the prairie. When the tears finally stopped, he dug their graves himself, each shovelful of earth burying another piece of his heart. That night, he cleaned his gun one last time and whispered a solemn vow. "No more death. No more vengeance. I promise you both. I'm done with killing." Asterisk. Charlie's voice brought Lucy back to the present. After that, he disappeared. Folks thought he was hunting Mitchell's brother, but he never did. Just wandered from town to town, taking whatever honest work he could find, trying to live quiet. And now he's here, Lucy said softly, letting Randy Monroe and his gang torment him rather than break that promise. Folks don't understand what it costs him, Charlie replied. They see weakness, but it takes more strength to hold back than to strike. Lucy found Jed at the stable later that morning, brushing down a horse with the same careful attention he gave to everything. She watched him work for a moment, seeing him with new eyes. How many? She asked quietly. Jed's hand stilled on the brush. 37, he answered without turning around. That's how many men I killed before I put the gun away. Each face as clear in my memory as if it happened yesterday. They were bad men, Lucy said. You brought justice. I brought death. Jed finally turned to face her. Every time I drew, I took a piece of my soul. Didn't matter if they deserved it. Killing changes you. Hardens something inside that wasn't meant to be hard. But now you're letting Randy. I made a promise, Jed cut her off. On my wife's grave, on my boy's memory. No more death. Sometimes promises need to bend, Lucy argued. You saw what they tried to do last night. Randy won't stop. A commotion outside interrupted her. Through the stable doors, they could see Earl Monroe, Randy's father, storming toward the sheriff's office. The wealthy rancher's face was red with anger as he burst through the door. Sheriff Brooks? Earl's voice carried across the street. I want something done about this Hawkins character. My boy tells me he threatened him last night. Lucy started to protest, but Jed shook his head, signaling her to wait. They could hear the conversation clearly through the open windows. Now Earl, Sheriff Brooks' placating tone drifted out. You know your boy ain't exactly an innocent victim here. Been hearing stories. I don't care what stories you've heard. Earl slammed his hand on the desk. That old man's stirring up trouble, and I want him gone. Don't make me take this to the county commissioner. The threat hung in the air. Everyone knew Earl Monroe's money carried weight with the local government. Jed turned back to his work, his movements unchanged, but Lucy saw something flicker in his eyes. Another memory seemed to take him. 20 years ago, a dusty street in Colorado Territory. His last gunfight before meeting Mary. The man across from him was young, eager to make a name for himself. Walk away, son, Jed had said. This life ain't what you think it is. But the young man wouldn't listen. His draw was fast, but Jed's was faster. Always faster. As the youth lay dying, he grabbed Jed's coat. Why? He gasped. Why do you have to be so fast? The question haunted him still, asterisk. I understand now, Lucy said softly, watching Jed work. Why you won't fight back. But Randy's not going to stop. He's going to keep pushing until something breaks. Something always breaks, Jed replied quietly. Question is, what are we willing to break with it? He set down the brush and turned to face her fully. I've walked that road, Lucy. Seen where it leads. Violence begets violence. Revenge breeds revenge. It's a circle with no end. And what about justice? Lucy demanded. What about protecting the innocent? Justice. Jed's laugh was bitter. I dealt out plenty of that. Shot men down in the name of law and order. And you know what I learned? He gestured toward the street, where Earl Monroe was still ranting in the sheriff's office. True justice ain't about who's fastest with a gun. It's about changing hearts, changing minds. That takes more courage than pulling a trigger. But sometimes you have to fight, Lucy insisted. Sometimes there's no other way. Jed was quiet for a long moment, looking past her at something only he could see. I killed my first man when I was 19, he finally said. He was robbing a widow's store. I felt righteous about it, proud even. Each killing after that got easier, more justified. Didn't realize until too late what it was doing to me inside. He picked up the brush again, his movements gentle on the horse's flank. When Mitchell's brother killed Mary and Thomas, my first thought wasn't grief. It was revenge. And that scared me more than anything, knowing how easily I could fall back into that life, become the very thing I'd spent years fighting against. Lucy watched him work, understanding finally reaching her heart. So you made your promise. To them, and to myself? Jed nodded. No more death. No more vengeance. No matter the provocation. And if Randy forces your hand? Lucy asked softly. If he leaves you no choice? Jed's hand stilled again. There's always a choice, girl. Always a way that doesn't end in blood. Just got to be strong enough to find it. Outside, Earl Monroe's voice rose again. I mean it, Sheriff. Either that old man leaves town, or there's going to be trouble. Lucy stepped closer to Jed. Randy won't stop, she said urgently. And now his father's involved. They're going to keep pushing until I break my promise? Jed shook his head. Or until I run away. Neither's going to happen. Then what will you do? Jed turned to look at her, his eyes holding decades of pain and wisdom. What I've been doing? Stand my ground. Show there's another way. Maybe, just maybe, break this cycle before it claims another generation. Lucy felt tears in her eyes. And if you can't? Then I'll face whatever comes, he said simply. But I won't dishonor their memory. Won't let violence take what's left of my soul. She watched him return to his work, this quiet man who had once been legend. The morning sun streamed through the stable doors, catching dust motes in its beams, while outside, the sounds of Millbrook's daily life continued. But Lucy felt as if she were witnessing something profound, a battle between past and present, between the man Jed had been and the man he'd chosen to become. The question was, which man would Millbrook need before this was over? And could Jed keep his promise when the moment of truth finally arrived? As if reading her thoughts, Jed spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Every man's got a choice, Lucy. Every day, we choose who we're going to be. Randy Monroe, his father, they've made their choices. Now we'll see if this town can make a better one. Lucy nodded slowly, understanding at last the true weight of the burden he carried. It wasn't just about keeping a promise to the dead. It was about showing the living there was another way. But as she left the stable, she couldn't shake the feeling that events were building towards something inevitable. Randy's pride, his father's influence, the town's growing tensions. All of it was leading toward a moment of truth. And when that moment came, all of Jed's promises might not be enough to stop what was coming. The night wrapped around Millbrook like a black velvet cloak, broken only by the thin sliver of a waning moon. In his modest cabin, Jed Hawkins slept fitfully, his dreams haunted by memories of smoke and gunfire. The photograph of Mary and Thomas watched over him from his place of honor, their frozen smiles a reminder of everything he'd lost. He didn't hear them approach. Randy's gang had tethered their horses half a mile away, creeping up on foot through the darkness. Pete Dawson carried the oil cans, while Mike Taylor and Jack Wilson spread hay and kindling around the cabin's base. Randy supervised, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a matchbox in the other. Time to smoke out the old hawk, Randy slurred, striking a match. The flame caught his face in harsh relief, showing a smile that held no humor. Let's see how brave he is when his nest is burning. The hay caught first, then the oil-soaked wood. The dry timber of the cabin, baked by years of western sun, went up like tinder. Within minutes, flames were licking up the walls, smoke seeping through every crack. Inside, Jed woke to the crackling sound and the acrid smell. Heat pressed against the walls, an orange light danced under his door. Years of instinct took over. He grabbed his gun belt, the photograph of his family, and his coat, dropping to the floor where the air was clearest. The front door was already engulfed, so he crawled to the back window. Outside, he could hear drunken laughter and the sound of breaking glass as Randy's gang threw bottles of burning oil against the walls. Jed kicked out the window frame and pulled himself through, cutting his hands on broken glass. His horse, Belle, was screaming in terror, trying to break free from her hitching post as flames approached the stable. Fighting through smoke-induced coughs, Jed stumbled to her, freed her lead, and swung himself into the saddle. They galloped away from the inferno, the heat chasing them into the darkness while Randy's gang hooped and hollered behind them. Run, old man. Randy's voice carried on the night wind. Just like you always do. Jed didn't stop until he reached the creek a mile away. There, he slid from Belle's back and fell to his knees, retching from the smoke. When he could breathe again, he looked back to see his home of 5 years burning against the star-filled sky, a beacon of hate in the darkness. Dawn found him still at the creek, his few saved possessions laid out before him. His gun belt, the photograph, and the clothes on his back. Everything else, Mary's letters, Thomas's wooden horse, all the small treasures he'd carried from his past life, was gone. He led Belle back toward town as the sun rose, planning to stable her at Tom's smithy until he could figure out his next move. But as he passed the cemetery on the hill, something made him stop. Even from the road, he could tell something was wrong. The gate hung open, swinging in the morning breeze. Fresh boot prints marked the dew-wet grass. And there, where Mary and Thomas's crosses stood, he saw splashes of dark paint against white wood. Each step up the hill felt like a mile. The crosses had been defaced with crude drawings and cruel words. "Coward's woman" was scrawled across Mary's marker. On Thomas's, someone had written "better dead than raised by yellow." Jed stood very still, looking at this final desecration. Something shifted inside him, like a key turning in a lock. When he finally moved, it was with a different kind of grace, the fluid economy of movement that had once made him legend. In town, Randy and his gang were already holding court at the Golden Spur, despite the early hour. They'd been drinking since the fire, celebrating their victory. Should have seen him run. Randy crowed to the morning crowd. The great hawk, flying away from a little fire. He demonstrated with flapping motions, splashing whiskey on the bar. Lucy stood frozen behind the counter, her face pale with shock and anger. "You could have killed him," she whispered. "That was the idea, sweetheart," Randy laughed. "But he's too yellow even to die proper." The saloon's doors swung open, and conversation died. Jed stood in the doorway, backlit by the morning sun. Smoke stains darkened his clothes, and dried blood crusted his hands where the glass had cut them. But it was his eyes that silenced the room, cold and focused, like a hawk sighting prey. He walked to the general store first, his spurs making no sound on the wooden sidewalk. Inside, he set a few coins on the counter. "Box of .45 cartridges," he said quietly. "And a cleaning kit." Mr. Thompson's hands shook as he gathered the items. Everyone in town had seen the glow of the fire in the night, had heard Randy's drunken boasting. They knew what was coming. Next, Jed visited Tom's smithy, where Belle would be safe. The blacksmith tried to speak, to offer sympathy or support, but Jed's expression stopped him. This wasn't the quiet, stable hand they'd known. This was someone else, someone from the stories. Lucy caught up to him as he checked his saddle straps. "Mr. Hawkins, Jed, please. Don't do this. Don't let them make you break your promise." Jed paused, his hands stilling on the leather. "Some promises have to yield to necessity, girl. Like a bone that breaks to avoid shattering completely. But you said violence only breeds more violence." Lucy grabbed his arm. "If you do this, if you become what you were before." "I already am what I was before." Jed's voice was gentle, but his eyes remained hard. "Been fooling myself, thinking I could bury it. But some things don't stay buried." He looked toward the cemetery on the hill. "Some things shouldn't. Then they win," Lucy pleaded. "Everything you've stood for, everything you've taught this town about finding another way. Sometimes the other way leads right back to where you started." Jed removed her hand from his arm. "They didn't just burn my home, Lucy. They didn't just mock my dead. They showed this town that evil triumphs when good men do nothing." He turned away, leading Belle back to her stall. "Get clear of town tomorrow at dawn. Take anyone you care about with you. What's coming isn't for decent folks to see." That night, in Tom's back room, Jed sat at a workbench with his revolver laid out before him. The pearl handle gleamed in the lamplight as he cleaned each part with practiced care, his movements precise and methodical. Years fell away with each stroke of the cleaning cloth, muscle memory returning like an old friend. He practiced his draw, over and over, until the motion was as smooth as poetry. Each time, the gun seemed to appear in his hand by magic, as Charlie had described in his stories. His reputation hadn't been built on speed alone. It was this fluid precision, this economy of movement, that had made him legend. When the gun was clean and his draw was perfect, Jed sat down to write. The letter to Lucy took shape slowly, each word carefully chosen. Asterisk, Dear Lucy, by the time you read this, what's done will be done. I want you to understand why. It's not about revenge, though some might see it that way. It's about responsibility. I thought I could teach this town a better way. Thought my example might show them that violence isn't the answer. Instead, I taught the wrong lesson, that evil goes unchecked as long as good people refuse to stand against it. I made a promise to Mary and Thomas that I'd never kill again. But I made an earlier promise, the day I first pinned on a badge, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes we have to choose which promise to keep. If I don't return, please look after Belle. She's known too much loss already. The money in my saddlebags will cover her feed for a year. After that, sell her to someone kind. Thank you for reminding an old man what it means to care about justice. Jed Hawkins *. He sealed the letter and placed it in his coat pocket. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the drama about to unfold beneath them. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a day of reckoning. Jed spent the rest of the night in prayer and meditation, not for himself but for the boy he'd once been, the man he'd become, and the lives he'd taken and saved along the way. When dawn's first light touched the eastern sky, he stood and buckled on his gun belt. The weight felt familiar, like greeting an old friend or remembering a dance step. He walked out into the silent streets of Millbrook, his boots striking the wooden sidewalk with quiet authority. The town was still sleeping, unaware that legend had returned to walk its streets. At the edge of the town square, Jed paused. The morning sun painted the buildings in shades of gold and shadow, just as it had in 100 other towns, before 100 other fights. But this one would be different. This one would be his last. Time to finish it, he whispered to the dawn. Then he walked into the square, ready to meet whatever fate had in store, his shadow stretching behind him like all the years between who he'd been and who he'd tried to become. News travels fast in a small town, especially when it carries the scent of gun smoke. By the time the sun had cleared the horizon, everyone in Millbrook knew that Jed Hawkins was waiting in the town square. They knew about his burned cabin, the desecrated graves, and most importantly, they knew who he really was. Hawks called them out, whispered Mrs. Peterson to her neighbor as they hurried toward the square. After what they did to his place, he's finally showing his true colors. The crowd gathered slowly at first, then faster as word spread. Shopkeepers abandoned their morning routines, ranch hands delayed their departures, and even the children were kept home from school. They formed a wide circle around the square, maintaining a respectful distance from the lone figure standing in its center. Jed stood perfectly still, his coat open despite the morning chill, gun belt riding low on his hip. The pearl-handled revolver caught the early light, its surface unmarred by the previous night's fire. His face might have been carved from stone for all the emotion it showed. Lucy watched from the doorway of the Golden Spur, her hands clasped tightly together. She'd read his letter at dawn, the paper still smelling faintly of smoke, and understood finally that this moment had been inevitable from the start. He's going to kill them all, someone whispered in the crowd. Good, came the reply. After what they did, the murmuring stopped abruptly as Randy Monroe and his gang swaggered into view. They'd been drinking all night, celebrating their victory over the old man, and the news of the challenge had caught them by surprise. Well, look who found his courage, Randy called out, his voice carrying across the square. His gang spread out behind him, trying to look confident despite their obvious nervousness. Finally decided to stop running. Old man? Jed didn't respond. His stillness seemed to draw all the attention in the square, making Randy's movements appear jerky and uncertain by comparison. What's the matter? Randy continued, his hand hovering near his gun. Cat got your tongue? Or just scared now that it's come to? Check your weapon, Jed interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the morning air. Make sure it's loaded. I want no excuses afterward. The professional courtesy, delivered in such a cold tone, seemed to unsettle Randy more than any threat could have. He fumbled with his gun, nearly dropping it as he checked the chambers. Lucy saw what others might have missed, the subtle shift in Jed's stance, the way his right hand hung relaxed but ready. This wasn't the quiet, stable hand they'd known. This was Hawk, the legend who had once brought law to the lawless territories. Sheriff. The bellow came from the edge of the crowd as Earl Monroe pushed his way through, his face red with exertion. Sheriff Brooks, I demand you stop this at once. Sheriff Brooks, who had been watching from the steps of his office, shook his head. No law against a fair fight, Earl. And after what your boy did, you let the sentence hang. I'm the biggest landowner in the county. Earl's voice rose higher. I'll have your badge for this. Maybe, Brooks replied calmly. But right now, I'm still sheriff. And I'm saying this goes forward. Earl turned to the crowd, appealing for support, but found only cold faces. The burning of Jed's cabin, the desecration of the graves, these had crossed lines that even Earl's money couldn't excuse. In the square, Jed spoke again. "This is your only warning, boy. Walk away. Take your friends and leave town. Don't look back." For a moment, something like sense seemed to flicker in Randy's eyes. But then he glanced at his gang, at his father, at the watching crowd. Pride and whiskey won out over wisdom. "To hell with you." He drew his gun with a flourish, pointing it skyward, and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked across the square like thunder. What happened next seemed to defy natural law. Before the echo of Randy's shot had died, before anyone could blink, Jed's gun appeared in his hand, as if by magic. His single shot was so precise, so perfectly placed, that it struck the cylinder of Randy's revolver, sending it spinning from his grasp. Randy stared at his empty hand in disbelief, a thin line of blood appearing where the ricocheting metal had grazed his palm. Pete Dawson panicked first, drawing and firing wildly. His shot went wide, shattering a window behind Jed. The old gunfighter's response was another blur of motion, another crack of sound. Pete's gun flew from his grasp, along with two of his fingers. Mike Taylor and Jack Wilson opened fire together, their shots kicking up dust around Jed's feet. But he was already moving, his actions flowing like water. Two more shots, precisely placed. Mike's gun hand took a bullet through the wrist, while Jack's weapon was literally shot apart in his grasp. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. For men lay in the dust, wounded but alive, their guns scattered and broken around them. Jed stood exactly where he'd started, gun still smoking in his hand. The silence that followed seemed to ring louder than the gunfire. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the morning birds had gone quiet. Jed surveyed the scene with cold eyes, then smoothly holstered his revolver. "It's over," he said simply. Randy lay curled around his injured hand, all his bravado gone. You could have killed us all." "Yes." Jed's voice carried no emotion. "Remember that." The crowd began to stir, people moving to help the wounded men. Doc Sanders pushed through, already rolling up his sleeves, while Sheriff Brooks approached with handcuffs ready. Earl Monroe stood frozen, watching his son whimper in the dust. All his money, all his influence, meant nothing in the face of such skill and precision. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it and turned away, shoulders slumped in defeat. Lucy stepped into the square, her face pale but determined. "You didn't kill them," she said softly as she reached Jed's side. "Didn't need to." Jed watched as Pete Dawson was helped to his feet, crying over his lost fingers. Sometimes mercy teaches a harder lesson than death. The townsfolk were already gathering in small groups, excitedly discussing what they'd witnessed. The story would grow with each telling. How the legendary Hawk had emerged from retirement to face down 4 armed men. How he'd disarmed them all without taking a life. How justice had finally come to Millbrook. But Lucy saw what others missed. The slight tremor in Jed's hand as he adjusted his gun belt. The sadness in his eyes as he watched the wounded men being led away. This hadn't been a triumph for him, but a necessity. A last resort when all other paths had been exhausted. "What happens now?" she asked. Jed looked around the square, at the faces that now regarded him with a mixture of awe and fear. The same looks he'd seen in 100 towns before, the weight of legends settling back onto his shoulders. "Now," he said quietly, "we see if this town learned anything from all this. If they understand that standing up to evil doesn't always mean destroying it." Sheriff Brooks approached, touching his hat respectfully. "Mr. Hawkins, I'll need a statement about what led to this. The fire, the graves. You'll have it." Jed's voice was tired but firm. "Make sure charges are filed. Let the law do its work now." The sheriff nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Hawk had done what was necessary to stop the violence, but he was handing authority back to where it belonged. The crowd began to disperse as the morning wore on. The wounded were taken to Doc Sanders' office, the square was cleaned up, and slowly Millbrook began to return to its normal rhythm. But something had changed in the way people held themselves and the way they looked at each other. They had witnessed not just a gunfight, but a lesson in justice. Hawk could have killed them all, could have taken the revenge that many felt Randy's gang deserved. Instead, he had chosen a harder path, stopping the violence without becoming what he fought against. Lucy found him later at the cemetery, standing before the cleaned and restored graves of his family. The mocking messages had been washed away, the crosses repainted by volunteers from town. "You kept your promise," she said softly. Jed nodded, his eyes on the crosses. "Found a way between what was needed and what was right." He touched the pearl handle of his gun. "Sometimes the hardest victory is the one that leaves your enemy alive to learn from it." The sun climbed higher over Millbrook, burning away the morning mist. In Doc Sanders' office, Randy Monroe lay in pain, his bandaged hand a constant reminder of how close he'd come to death. His gang, similarly wounded and humbled, had time to contemplate the cost of their cruelty. Earl Monroe packed his bags, knowing his influence in the town was finished. The county commissioner might still be his friend, but no amount of money could erase what everyone had witnessed in the square. And in the hearts of Millbrook citizens, a story took root, not just of a legendary gunfighter's skill, but of a man who had found a way to bring justice without falling back into the cycle of violence he'd fought so hard to escape. The legend of Hawk would grow again, but this time with a different lesson. That true strength lies not in how many men you can kill, but in how many you choose not to. As the day wore on, life in Millbrook began to find a new rhythm. The Golden Spur filled with people discussing the morning's events, the general store reopened, and children returned to their games. But something fundamental had shifted in the way people carried themselves, in the way they treated each other. They had seen what one man's stand for justice could accomplish, and more importantly, they had witnessed the power of restraint. The next time trouble came to Millbrook, it wouldn't take a legend to face it down. The town had learned to stand up for itself. In the square where it had all happened, invisible to most eyes, the ghost of violence that had haunted Millbrook began to fade. Something new took its place, not the false peace of fear and submission, but the true peace that comes from justice tempered with mercy. The day would be long remembered in Millbrook's history, not for its gunplay or violence, but for the moment when a town finally understood that courage doesn't always wear a gun, and that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is choose not to kill when he has every right to do so. The dust was still settling in Millbrook's town square when Earl Monroe found his voice again. His face, already red from exertion, turned nearly purple with rage as he watched Doc Sanders tend to his son's wounded hand. "This is an outrage," he bellowed, turning to face the gathered crowd. "This man, this killer, comes into our peaceful town and attacks my boy. Are you all going to stand for this?" The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, but not in the way Earl was used to seeing. Instead of cowering from his anger, they drew themselves up straighter, exchanging glances of newfound courage. "Peaceful town." Martha Wilson stepped forward, her usually timid voice ringing clear. "Your son and his friends burned down a man's home. They desecrated graves." "That's right," Tom the blacksmith joined in. "And where were you, Earl, when your boy was terrorizing honest folk? Where was your concern for peace then?" Earl's eyes darted around the square, searching for familiar allies, but found only stern faces and crossed arms. Even his longtime friends were turning away, unwilling to meet his gaze. "Sheriff Brooks." Earl spun toward the lawman. "Are you going to let this happen? After all the support I've given you over the years?" The sheriff stood silent for a long moment, his weathered face troubled. Finally, he unpinned his badge and held it out. "No, Earl, I'm not," he said quietly. "Because I'm not sheriff anymore. Should have stopped your boy long ago. Should have stood up to you when you first started buying this town piece by piece. My failure to do that makes me as guilty as anyone." He placed the badge on a nearby barrel and stepped back. "Figure it's time for someone with a stronger spine to take this job." Deputy Jim Watson, who had served under Brooks for 5 years, picked up the badge. His young face was solemn as he pinned it to his own chest. "First order of business," he announced clearly, "is to arrest Randy Monroe and his associates for arson, vandalism, and attempted murder." Earl started to protest, but a dozen townspeople stepped forward, offering to testify about the gang's crimes. The wall of money and influence that had protected the Monroes for so long was crumbling before his eyes. Meanwhile, Randy sat in the dust of the square, cradling his injured hand and staring at Jed with a mixture of fear and amazement. The legendary gunfighter hadn't moved from his position, his presence still commanding the space without a word. "Please," Randy whispered as Deputy Watson approached with handcuffs. "Please, Mr. Hawkins, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I never meant." Jed finally turned to look at him, his eyes neither cruel nor kind. "Be better," he said simply. "That's all any man can do." Lucy emerged from the crowd with bandages and water, approaching Jed cautiously. During the brief but intense gunfight, a bullet had grazed his left arm, and glass from his burning cabin had left cuts on his hands. "Let me help," she said softly, leading him to sit on the edge of the horse trough. As she cleaned his wounds, she noticed how his hands trembled slightly, not from fear or pain, but from the effort of controlling his actions so precisely. "You could have killed them all," she murmured, wrapping a bandage around his arm. "But you didn't." "Killing's easy," Jed replied, watching as Deputy Watson and several volunteers led the arrested gang members toward the jail. "Living with it's the hard part." Pete Dawson, missing 2 fingers in his bravado, stumbled as he was led past. Mike Taylor's wrist was properly bandaged now, and Jack Wilson helped support him, both men looking shell-shocked and humbled. "What'll happen to them?" Lucy asked, tying off the bandage. "Deputy Watson's already sent for the federal marshal," Jed answered. "They'll stand trial in the territorial court. Better justice than they showed me." Earl Monroe watched his son being led away, his empire crumbling around him. The mighty rancher seemed to shrink before their eyes, his bluster replaced by the desperate realization that his money couldn't fix this situation. "This isn't over." He tried one last time, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Tom the blacksmith stated firmly. "Sell your land, Earl. Leave town, before we remember everything else you and your boy have done over the years." The crowd murmured agreement, and Earl Monroe, self-proclaimed king of Millbrook, turned and walked stiffly toward the bank. By sunset, he had sold his ranch to a consortium of local farmers at a fraction of its worth. His buggy was seen heading east, toward the railroad station, never to return. As the excitement died down, the townsfolk began to clear away the signs of conflict. Women brought brooms to sweep the square, men righted overturned water barrels, and children collected spent cartridges as souvenirs. There was an energy to their work, a sense of community reborn. "We'll help rebuild your cabin, Mr. Hawkins," Martha Wilson declared, and heads nodded all around. "Better than before. And until then, you can stay in my spare room," Tom added. "Least we can do after standing by so long." Lucy watched all this from the porch of the Golden Spur, Jed's letter heavy in her apron pocket. When the crowd thinned, she found a quiet moment to read it again, understanding now the full weight of his words. "I thought I could teach this town a better way," she read, tears blurring her vision. "Instead, I taught the wrong lesson, that evil goes unchecked as long as good people refuse to stand against it." But he had taught them something more valuable, she realized. Not just how to stand up to evil, but how to do it without becoming what they fought against. His restraint and victory spoke louder than any amount of violence could have. The sun was setting when she found him at the cemetery, standing before the restored graves of his family. The crosses gleamed with fresh white paint, all signs of desecration erased by caring hands. "The whole town's talking about what happened," she said, standing beside him. "About how the legendary Hawk returned." "Hawk's still retired," Jed replied wearily. "What they saw today wasn't about legend or reputation. It was about choice. The choice not to kill. The choice to be better." He touched Mary's cross gently. Randy Monroe made his choices. His father made his. For years, this town chose to look away. He turned to face her. Today, everyone chose differently. Lucy saw the exhaustion in his face, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. But there was something else too, a peace she hadn't seen before, as if some long-carried burden had finally been set down. "What will you do now?" she asked. Jed looked out over the town, where lights were beginning to twinkle in windows. The Golden Spur's cheerful noise drifted up the hill, mixed with the sound of hammers as men began repairs on the buildings damaged in the shooting. "Same as always," he said finally. "Tend the horses. Live quiet. Try to be better than I was the day before. But you'll stay?" A small smile touched his lips. "Seems I might have found a home worth keeping." They walked back toward town together, as evening settled over Millbrook. The day's events would be talked about for years to come, growing into legend with each telling. But the real story, Lucy knew, wasn't in the gunplay or the showdown. It was in the way a town had finally found its courage. In the way a man had faced his violent past without being consumed by it. In the way justice had been served without adding new graves to the cemetery. At the stable, Jed checked on his horse one last time before heading to Tom's spare room. Belle nickered softly as he stroked her nose, the same gentle touch that had once handled a gun with such deadly precision. "We did right by them," he whispered, thinking of Mary and Thomas. "Found a way to keep both promises." The night wrapped around Millbrook like a comfortable blanket, stars twinkling overhead. In the jail, Randy Monroe and his gang had time to contemplate their choices and their futures. In homes across town, people spoke in hushed voices about courage and redemption. And in his borrowed room, Jed Hawkins cleaned his gun one final time before putting it away. Tomorrow would bring the work of rebuilding, both his cabin and the town's spirit. But for now, he had done what needed doing, and done it without losing his soul in the process. The legend of Hawk would live on, but not as a tale of death and vengeance. Instead, it would be remembered as a story of restraint, of justice tempered with mercy, of a man who had found a way to be strong without being cruel. As Millbrook settled into sleep, the wind whispered through the streets, carrying away the last echoes of gunfire and violence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices. But the town had learned its lesson well, that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to show mercy when destruction would be easier. And in the cemetery on the hill, two crosses stood straight and proud, their fresh paint gleaming in the starlight, watching over a town that had finally found its way back to decency. A week after the showdown, Jed sat in his partially rebuilt cabin, watching the sunset through the new window frame. The townsfolk had worked tirelessly, replacing burned timbers and raising fresh walls. The structure was already stronger than before, built with better materials and more careful craftsmanship. But as he sat in his rocking chair, cleaning his revolver with practiced care, Jed felt the weight of recent events pressing down on him. The pearl handle gleamed in the fading light, each scratch telling a story of violence, even if justified. "Thought I was done with you," he murmured to the gun. "Thought I could leave it all behind." He ran his thumb over a fresh mark near the trigger guard, made during the showdown. "Even when we don't kill, we leave scars." The sound of boots on his new porch announced a visitor. Lucy stood in the doorway, her face troubled as she watched him with the weapon. "Still cleaning it?" she asked softly. "The fight was days ago." Jed carefully set the gun aside. "Old habits. Like old wounds. They're hard to let go." Lucy stepped inside, taking in the rebuilt walls, the new furniture donated by townspeople, the carefully salvaged photograph of Mary and Thomas in its restored frame. "You did what had to be done," she said, sitting across from him. "Nobody died. The Monroes are gone. The town is healing." "The town might be," Jed replied, his voice heavy. "But violence leaves marks on the soul, girl, even when it's righteous. Maybe especially then. You're worried about becoming him again, aren't you? The man they called Hawk." Jed's silence was answer enough. "But that's not what happened," Lucy pressed. "You showed restraint. You found another way." "Did I?" Jed stood, moving to the window. "Or did I just prove that violence is still the answer, as long as you're skilled enough to control it?" Before Lucy could respond, they heard more footsteps approaching. Martha Wilson appeared, carrying a fresh-baked pie, followed by her husband John. "Hope we're not interrupting," Martha said, setting the pie on Jed's new table. We wanted to thank you properly. And to apologize." John Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "Should have stood up to them years ago. We all should have. Let them bully us. Tell ourselves it wasn't our business when they hurt others." "No need for apologies," Jed said quietly. "Fear's a powerful thing. That's why we're grateful," Martha replied. "You showed us there's something stronger than fear, doing what's right." Throughout the day, more townspeople came. Tom the blacksmith, Charlie from the saloon, Mr. Thompson from the general store, each with gifts, thanks, and apologies. Each carrying the weight of years of silence, looking for absolution. Jed accepted their visits with quiet grace, but Lucy could see the toll it was taking on him. His movements were slower, his face more drawn. The fire, the fight, and now the constant stream of visitors were wearing him down. As evening approached, an unexpected visitor arrived. Randy Monroe, his injured hand still bandaged, stood nervously at the door. Under house arrest awaiting trial, he'd been granted permission to make this visit. "Mr. Hawkins," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need it. I had to." "Come in, boy," Jed said wearily. "Sit down before you fall down." Randy sank into a chair, his face haunted. "I can't sleep," he confessed. "Keep seeing it. How fast you were. How easily you could have." He swallowed hard. "Why didn't you kill us? Would it have made anything better if I had?" "No, but we deserved it. After what we did to your home, your family's graves. Deserving deaths, not the same as needing to die." Jed sat across from him. "You want to make amends?" Randy nodded desperately. "Then be better. Start by helping others instead of hurting them. Simple as that. Hard as that." "How?" Randy's voice cracked. "How do I even start?" "Same way you started being cruel. One choice at a time." Jed's voice was firm, but not unkind. "Every day, choose to be better than you were the day before." After Randy left, Jed's exhaustion finally showed. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the table. Lucy was at his side instantly. "You need rest," she insisted. "You're pushing yourself too hard." "Just tired." He tried to wave her off, but his legs betrayed him, buckling slightly. "Bed. Now." Lucy's tone brooked no argument. "Doctor's orders. Doc Sanders said you needed rest to heal properly." Jed allowed her to help him to his bedroom, where he sank onto the new mattress the townspeople had provided. "Seemed easier to recover from fights when I was younger." "That's because you didn't have people caring about you then," Lucy replied, checking his bandages. "Making sure you actually rested instead of pretending you were fine." Meanwhile, in the sheriff's office, Deputy Jim Watson, now officially appointed as sheriff, was outlining his plans to the town council. "Millbrook's got a chance to be something different," he explained, spreading a map on his desk. "A haven for honest folks, somewhere between the big cattle towns. Place where travelers and ranchers can rest easy, knowing they'll be treated fair." Inspired by Jed's example, one council member asked. Watson nodded. "Man showed us there's a way to have law without tyranny, strength without cruelty. Figure we can build a town on those principles." Back in his cabin, Jed lay awake, struggling with his thoughts. The town's gratitude, their desire to make him a symbol of justice, weighed heavily on him. He'd spent 15 years trying to escape his reputation, and now, "Maybe I should move on," he murmured to the darkness, "before they build me up into something I'm not." But the town had other ideas. The next morning brought the sound of hammers and saws as more people arrived to work on his cabin. They'd expanded the original plans, adding a proper porch, a larger stable for Belle, even a small garden plot that Martha Wilson had already started planting. Lucy arrived with breakfast, looking around at the progress. "They need you, you know," she said, setting down the basket. "Not as a legend or a gunfighter. As a reminder that one person standing up for what's right can change everything." As she helped clean up some debris, her hand brushed against something in a half-burned drawer, the letter Jed had written before the showdown. She'd read it once before, but seeing it again, understanding the depth of his struggle. "You wrote this thinking you might die," she said, holding up the letter. "But you found another way. Maybe that's what you're really meant to teach us, that there's always another way, if we're brave enough to look for it." Jed took the letter, looking at his own words with new eyes. "Been running for so long," he admitted, from what I did, trying to keep my promise to Mary and Thomas." "And you have kept it," Lucy insisted. "You showed mercy when you could have taken revenge. You proved that a man can change, can be better than his past. But can I stay here?" Jed gestured at the town beyond his window. "Knowing what they've seen me do? They've seen you show restraint when most men would have killed. They've seen you offer guidance to the very person who tried to destroy you. They've seen strength tempered with mercy." Lucy touched his arm gently. "Maybe that's exactly why you need to stay." The sun climbed higher over Millbrook, illuminating a town transformed. The square had been repaired, the businesses were thriving, and there was a new energy in the streets. People walked taller, spoke more freely, looked out for each other in ways they hadn't before. Inside his cabin, Jed Hawkins watched it all with quiet amazement. He'd come to Millbrook seeking anonymity, a place to bury his past. Instead, he'd found something he'd thought lost forever: a home, a purpose, and maybe even a kind of peace. Tired of running, he admitted finally, his voice soft but sure. Tired of being alone. Lucy smiled, understanding the magnitude of what he was saying. Then don't run. Stay. Be part of what you helped create here. Outside, the sounds of hammering continued as the townsfolk worked to rebuild not just a cabin, but a community. And inside, an old gunfighter finally began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had found where he belonged. Spring came to Millbrook with a burst of wildflowers and fresh purpose. The town square, scene of the famous showdown just months ago, had been transformed for a celebration. Colorful banners hung between buildings, tables groaned with home-cooked food, and the sound of fiddle music filled the air. Sheriff Jim Watson stood on a hastily constructed platform, addressing the gathered crowd. 6 months ago, this town was dying, he announced, his voice carrying across the square. Not just in business, but in spirit. We'd forgotten what it meant to stand together, to stand up for what's right. The townsfolk nodded, many glancing toward Jed Hawkins, who stood quietly at the edge of the gathering. Today, we celebrate more than just new businesses opening, Watson continued. We celebrate a community reborn. The Monroe Ranch has been divided among smaller farmers. The Golden Spur is now owned by its workers. And most importantly, we've remembered who we are. Martha Wilson wiped tears from her eyes as she looked around at the changes. The general store had a fresh coat of paint. The bank had removed the iron bars from its windows, and 3 new shops had opened on Main Street. But the biggest change was in the people themselves, the way they held their heads high, the way they looked out for each other. Near the stable, Randy Monroe worked steadily, brushing down a horse with careful attention. His injured hand had healed well enough to grip the brush, though 2 fingers remained permanently missing. The past months had changed him as much as they had changed the town. Easy there, girl, he murmured to the horse, using the gentle tone Jed had taught him. That's right, nice and smooth. Jed watched from the stable doorway, noting Randy's improved technique. After his trial, where Jed had testified about his genuine remorse, Randy had been sentenced to work restitution instead of jail time. He'd asked to serve it at the stable, under Jed's supervision. Better, Jed commented, causing Randy to start slightly. You're learning to feel the horse's mood, not just go through the motions. Still got a lot to learn, Randy replied, his former arrogance replaced by genuine humility. About horses. About everything. Jed nodded and entered the stable, picking up another brush to work alongside his unlikely apprentice. These quiet moments of shared work had done more to reform Randy than any punishment could have. Afternoon, if you're ready, Jed said carefully, we'll work with the unloaded revolver again. Practice drawing smooth, not fast. Randy's face lit up. He'd been asking to learn proper gun handling, not for violence, but to understand the responsibility Jed had tried to teach him. Each lesson began and ended with the same reminder. A gun's not for proving you're strong. It's for protecting those who can't protect themselves. The celebration in the square continued as more people arrived from neighboring farms and ranches. Millbrook was becoming known as a fair place to do business, where the law treated everyone equally and disputes were settled with words instead of weapons. Lucy watched it all from the porch of the Golden Spur, her notebook open on her lap. She'd been recording everything: the showdown, the town's transformation, and most importantly, Jed's quiet wisdom. The pages were filled with his sayings, his teachings about justice and mercy. Writing my story again? Jed asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. Writing our story, Lucy corrected, accepting a cup. The whole town's story. People need to know that change is possible, that it's never too late to choose a different path. Speaking of choices, Jed said softly, heard you turned down that job offer from the big newspaper in Denver. Lucy smiled, looking out at the bustling square. Millbrook needs its own voice now. Besides, she glanced at him sideways, someone has to keep track of all the wisdom you're always muttering under your breath. Before Jed could respond, a commotion near his cabin caught their attention. Sheriff Watson was trying to organize a group of townspeople who all seemed to be talking at once. "Now?" someone asked. "Yes, now," Martha Wilson replied, while he's distracted by the celebration. Curious, Jed and Lucy walked toward the growing crowd. As they approached, people began moving aside, creating a path toward Jed's cabin. But it wasn't the cabin he'd been living in for the past months. Where his modest home had stood, a new structure rose proudly. The townsfolk had been working in secret, using the celebration as cover for their final touches. The cabin was nearly twice the size of his old one, with a wraparound porch, proper glass windows, and a stone chimney. "We all pitched in," Sheriff Watson explained, grinning at Jed's stunned expression. "Figure a man who gave us back our dignity deserves a proper home." I can't accept," Jed started, but Martha Wilson cut him off. "You can, and you will, Jed Hawkins. Every nail, every board, every minute of work was given freely, out of gratitude and respect." Lucy gently took Jed's arm and led him up the porch steps. Inside, the main room was furnished with handcrafted pieces from Tom's workshop. A pot of coffee bubbled on the new stove, making the space feel already lived in. But it was the mantel that caught Jed's eye. There, in a beautifully carved frame, was the photograph of Mary and Thomas that he'd saved from the fire. Someone had carefully restored it, removing the smoke damage and bringing their faces back to clarity. Jed touched the frame gently, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise," he whispered to their smiling faces, "to live in a way that would make you proud. To use what I know to help, not harm." He was already keeping that promise. Word had spread about the legendary gunfighter who chose mercy over vengeance, and young men from around the territory began seeking him out. They came expecting to learn about fast draws and gunfighting. Instead, they learned about responsibility, about the weight of carrying a weapon, and the wisdom of choosing not to use it. Each morning now found Jed at the stable, surrounded by eager students. He taught them to ride properly, to rope cattle without cruelty, to handle guns with respect rather than bravado. Randy worked alongside him, his own experience serving as a powerful lesson about the cost of choosing the wrong path. "Speed's nothing without control," Jed would tell them, demonstrating with an unloaded gun. "And control's nothing without wisdom. A man needs to master himself before he can hope to master a weapon." Lucy watched these sessions from the stable door, her pencil flying across the pages of her notebook. She was capturing not just Jed's words, but the transformation she saw in his students, especially Randy, who worked the hardest to prove himself worthy of a second chance. One peaceful evening, as the summer sun painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Jed sat on his new porch, rocking gently in a chair Tom had made specially to fit his frame. Lucy joined him, bringing fresh coffee and her ever-present notebook. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The excitement, the reputation?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunset. "Used to think that's what life was about, making a name for yourself, being the fastest, the deadliest. Took losing everything to learn what really matters." "And what's that?" "Being someone who helps others find their better nature." He smiled slightly. "Even if they have to get shot in the hand first to start looking for it." Lucy laughed, then grew serious. "The town's changed so much." "You've changed it." "No," Jed shook his head. "The town changed itself. Just needed a reminder that it could." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness crept over the land. From the town came the sounds of people heading home from the celebration, their voices happy and relaxed. A dog barked, a baby cried, a mother sang, all the normal sounds of a community at peace with itself. The next morning, Jed saddled Belle early. The mare was getting older, but still had plenty of spirit, especially for morning rides. Lucy found him checking the cinch. "Going somewhere?" she asked, trying to keep the worry from her voice. "Just a ride," Jed assured her. "Need to remind myself what I was running from, and what I found instead." He mounted up with the same fluid grace that had once made him legendary, though now he used it more for teaching young riders than for gunfighting. As he rode down Main Street, people called out greetings, children waved, and even the old-timers nodded respectfully. At the edge of town, Jed reined Belle to a stop and looked back. Millbrook was coming alive in the morning sun, the same way it did every day now. But he saw it with new eyes, not as a place to hide, but as a home to protect and nurture. He touched the brim of his hat in a silent salute to the watching townspeople, then turned Bell toward the open prairie. The morning air was crisp and clean, full of possibility. Somewhere out there, the ghost of Hawk still rode, still haunted the territories with tales of lightning-fast draws and deadly accuracy. But here in Millbrook, Jed Hawkins had found something better than legend. He'd found redemption, not just for himself, but for an entire community. He'd found a way to keep his promise to Mary and Thomas while still standing up for what was right. As he rode out across the flowering prairie, Jed felt truly at peace for the first time in years. The weight of his gun was still there at his hip, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it was a reminder of choices made and lessons learned. He would return before sunset, as he always did now. There were horses to tend, students to teach, and a community that had become family. But for now, he let Belle have her head, let her run just for the joy of it, while behind him, Millbrook stood as a testament to the power of second chances. The legend of Hawk would live on in Lucy's writings, in the stories told around campfires, in the lessons taught at his stable. But it would be a different kind of legend now, not about the speed of his draw or the notches on his gun, but about the day a quiet man stood up to bullies without becoming what he fought against. And in that legend, people would find hope. Hope that no matter how far you've wandered, you can find your way home. Hope that it's never too late to choose a better path. Hope that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from helping them become better people. Belle's hooves thundered across the prairie as Jed let her run, her mane flying in the wind. Behind them, Millbrook grew smaller, but never disappeared, like a beacon showing the way home. And for the first time in 15 years, Jed Hawkins rode, not to escape his past, but to embrace his future. What would you have done in Jed's place? Would you have chosen revenge, or found the harder path of mercy? If this tale of redemption and second chances touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that explore the complex choices between justice and vengeance. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on Jed's decision to show mercy to Randy and his gang. And remember, sometimes the greatest battles we fight are not against our enemies, but against the darkness within ourselves. Join us next time for another story that challenges what we think we know about courage, redemption, and the power of choosing to be better than we were yesterday.